Port Solace, Maine, 1890. There was a morning before everything broke when Micah Ashford walked the cliff path above the harbor with Eliora Vance beside him and felt, for the first time in his 26 years, that his life had finally arrived where it belonged. It was late May. The Atlantic was doing what it does in the last days of spring, throwing up a cold, bright spray that caught the light and scattered it. And the gorse along the cliff top had gone yellow overnight the way it always seemed to, as though the whole headland had decided at once that winter was finished. The air smelled of salt and wet rope and the tar they used on the hulls down at the yard, and underneath all of it, faintly, the lilacs that grew wild along the fence behind the lighthouse keeper's cottage. Below them, down in the harbor proper, the fishing boats were already out, small dark shapes against water gone the color of hammered pewter, and somewhere further off a bell buoy was tolling slow and irregular with the swell, a sound so constant to that stretch of coast that neither of them consciously heard it anymore, though they would each remember it clearly years later when they tried to describe that particular morning to their own children. They had walked this path 100 times since they were children, but that morning it felt different to him. The way a familiar room feels different once you've decided something is going to happen inside it. Eliora's dark hair was loose under her shawl, blown sideways by the wind coming off the water, and she kept pushing it back with one hand without seeming to notice she was doing it. Micah had known he was going to ask her since the previous autumn. He had been waiting for the right morning, which kept turning into the next morning and the one after that, because every morning with Eliora felt like the right one, and none of them felt large enough to hold what he wanted to say. He stopped at the place where the path widened out above the rocks, where you could see clean across to the lighthouse her father kept, and he asked her. She said yes before the question was fully out of his mouth, and told him afterward that she had known since the winter 3 years before, when he'd rowed out in a gale to help her father secure the lamp-room shutters and had come back to the cottage soaked through and shaking with cold, refusing a blanket until he'd checked that she was warm first. She had watched him standing there dripping on the doorstep, more concerned with her comfort than his own, and had understood in that moment exactly what she was going to do with her life. He asked her in May, on the cliff path, with the gorse blooming yellow around them, and she said yes, and they walked back down toward the harbor with the whole of Port Solace laid out below them and every ordinary future they'd ever imagined arranged in front of them like something that had simply been waiting to be claimed. The weeks after were the finest of Micah's life, and he would say so later, when he had the distance to say it plainly, that those weeks were the finest, and that he hadn't known at the time they were already ending, which is nearly always true of the finest weeks a person gets. Eliora's aunt began sewing the wedding dress in early June, working from a pattern that had come over from Portland by post. Micah saw it once by accident, arriving at the cottage earlier than expected and finding the door standing open, Eliora at the window in the half-finished bodice, the afternoon light coming through the thin cotton, her dark hair down around her shoulders, her face wearing the particular expression of someone trying on a life and finding that it fits her exactly. She hadn't seen him. He hadn't made a sound. He stood in the doorway for a handful of seconds and then withdrew quietly, because the moment plainly wasn't his to walk into. He thought about it for days afterward, the image returning to him at odd moments, hauling line at the yard, walking home past dusk, not as something he'd intruded on, but as something he'd been given a glimpse of, the way you're sometimes given a glimpse of weather still a day off. He was 26. He had a share in the shipyard his uncle had built up over 30 years, and a boat of his own nearly ready to come off the ways that autumn, a sloop he'd been building evenings and Sundays for the better part of 2 years with an eye toward taking Eliora out along the coast once they were married. He had already decided, though he hadn't told her yet, that he would name it after her mother, who had died when Eliora was young, and whom Eliora rarely spoke of except in the particular quiet way people speak of the dead they still miss badly. He was going to marry Eliora Vance in September, and the dress was being made, and the boat was nearly finished, and everything in the world seemed to be sitting exactly where it was meant to sit. What he did not know was the name Silas Drummond. Eliora knew it. She had known it since the previous winter, when she'd gone into town for thread and had seen him standing outside the chandelier, watching her the way he always watched her, which wasn't the way a man watches a woman he admires. It was the way a man watches something he's already decided belongs to him, and is simply waiting for the right moment to collect. She had been 19 the first time she understood what that particular look meant. When Drummond had first come to Port Solace running cargo up and down the coast in a boat, nobody asked too many questions about, and she had been careful of him ever since. She told herself there was nothing worth telling Micah, that she'd seen a man on the street and hurried past him, and that was the whole of it, and that raising it at all would only worry him over a thing that would very likely come to nothing. The way most uncomfortable feelings about strangers on a street do come to nothing, most of the time. She told herself this through June, while the dress went on being made, and the September date sat fixed on the calendar, and Micah came to supper on Sundays with a particular happiness of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and still can't quite believe it's real. She told herself this for 6 weeks. Then on a Tuesday evening in the middle of July, Silas Drummond came to the cottage while her father was out checking the lamp. He sat at her kitchen table uninvited. He told her, without ever once raising his voice, exactly what would happen to Micah Ashford's new boat, and to Micah himself, if the wedding in September went forward as planned. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't needed to. He'd simply described, in a flat, unhurried voice, the sort of accident that could befall a new sloop still up on the ways, and the sort of accident that could befall the man who built it, and had done it all while turning his hat over in his hands as though discussing the weather. Then he'd stood, thanked her for the tea she hadn't offered him, and let himself out the same door he'd let himself in through, and she had sat at the table for a long while afterward listening to her own pulse before she trusted herself to stand. She wrote the letter that same night by candlelight at the same table where he'd sat, crossing out 3 separate attempts before she found words plain enough to leave no room for Micah to argue his way past them. Micah found it on a Thursday morning. He had come for breakfast the way he always did, and the cottage door was unlocked. And Eliora's father was standing in the front room with the look of a man who has been sitting alone with bad news for several hours and doesn't know what to do with his hands. He handed Micah the folded paper without a word. Eliora's writing, careful, deliberate. The handwriting of someone who has drafted and redrafted what she needed to say until it could no longer be softened. Micah, I am so sorry. I cannot explain all of it here, but I have to go, and I need you to let me. Please do not come looking for me. Please go on and live your life. You deserve someone who can stand beside you without danger following her in. I love you, and it is because I love you that I am asking you not to follow. He read it 4 times standing in the doorway. He walked to the coastal steamer office at the harbor that same hour. The clerk remembered a young woman with dark hair who had bought passage south that morning, though he couldn't say for certain where she'd disembarked past Portland. Micah walked back to the cottage, sat at the kitchen table, and read the letter again in the empty room. He thought about chasing after her on the next boat out. He thought about the 2 words in the middle of the page, "Please do not," and turned them over for hours, trying to decide whether a man who loved someone honored the words she'd written or the life the 2 of them had already begun building together. He sat with the question until the light went out of the window. He went home. He did not follow her. He told himself this was respect, was honoring what she'd asked of him, and he did not yet understand that it was the wrong decision. He only knew the letter had said please do not, and he had chosen to obey it. He would spend the better part of 2 years turning that choice over and would never once stop believing, somewhere underneath the reasoning, that she had needed him to make a different one. 2 years is not, by most measures, a very long stretch of time. By the measure of a man who has lost the person he was going to spend his life with, without explanation, without a destination to picture her in, without any way of knowing whether she'd left of her own will or been driven out, 2 years turns out to be considerably longer than the calendar suggests. Micah kept working the shipyard, because the work demanded it and because it was the one reliable thing available to a man trying not to think about the one thing he thought about constantly. He didn't search for her. He'd promised not to, and he kept that promise, though it cost him a great deal more than the promising had. There were stretches when he told himself she was simply well, had simply decided she wanted a different life than the one he'd offered. There were other stretches, fewer as the months wore on but never entirely gone, when he thought about the name Drummond, which he'd heard once, sideways, from a man at the chandlery who'd stopped talking the second he saw Micah's face. He hadn't pressed for more. He hadn't pressed because pressing led somewhere he wasn't ready to follow. There was a night in the first winter when he'd gone as far as walking down to the harbor office to ask about passage to Bath. Having heard secondhand, wrongly as it turned out, that she might have gone there, and he'd stood outside the shuttered office in the cold for the better part of 20 minutes before he made himself turn around and walk home. Because the letter had said, "Please do not." And he had decided, standing there in the dark with his breath fogging in front of him, that a promise you only kept when it was easy wasn't a promise worth much of anything. He never told anyone about that night, not even Eliora. Not for a long while after. It stayed his alone, the closest he ever came to breaking his word, and the fact that he hadn't, in the end, become something he was privately, quietly proud of. He'd barely let himself think about it afterward. In the spring of the second year, he folded the half-finished wedding dress. Eliora's aunt had sent it to him, not knowing what else to do with it, into a chest in the back room, not to forget it. Because having it in plain sight was a daily difficulty, he wasn't going to permit himself, but because it needed to go somewhere. He was 27, then 28. He ran the yard and rowed out most evenings past the point, alone, watching the light go down over water that never once gave him an answer no matter how long he sat on it. He finished the sloop that first autumn anyway, planked her and rigged her, and painted her name along the transom in careful gold letters. And then never once took her out for anything beyond hauling gear, because taking her out for pleasure felt like a thing that belonged to a future that had stopped arriving. People in Port Solace were kind about it in the way small harbor towns are kind, which is to say they mostly left him alone and only occasionally, and always gently, asked whether he'd heard anything. He hadn't. He told them so plainly enough that after a while they stopped asking. And he was grateful for that, though the quiet that replaced the asking wasn't exactly a relief either. On a Tuesday in September of the second year, he went down to the harbor for a delivery of caulking cotton and ended up somewhere else entirely. 40 yards down the wharf. Dark hair, pulled back under a plain gray bonnet. The particular unhurried way of carrying herself that he would have known blindfolded, a single traveling case in one hand, walking briskly toward the steamer landing where the afternoon boat to Portland was already taking on its last passengers. Micah stopped dead on the wharf boards. He stood there in the middle of the foot traffic and looked at the back of a woman he hadn't laid eyes on in 2 years and knew, with the specific certainty of a man who has spent a decade paying attention to exactly one person, that it was her. She was moving fast. He moved faster. He reached the ticket window as she was already climbing the gangway. Whatever she just bought passage for, he told the clerk, the last one, and paid whatever was asked without waiting to hear the fare. He ran down the wharf as the deckhands were casting off the lines. The gap between the hull and the pilings was already widening, a slow black stripe of harbor water opening up beneath him, and he jumped it, caught the rail, and hauled himself over onto the deck as the steamer's engine found its rhythm and Port Solace began sliding away behind the stern. He stood there a moment, catching his breath with a ticket in his fist and nothing else but 2 years of a promise he'd kept exactly as she'd asked. Then he went looking for her. He found her below decks in the second cabin, seated by a porthole, hands folded in her lap, watching the harbor recede into a gray smear on the horizon, wearing the expression of someone who has just done a difficult thing and is now bracing herself to carry the weight of having done it. He sat down across from her. She turned. The color went out of her face entirely. For a moment that was not a short one, neither of them said anything at all, while the coastline slid by outside the glass. "Micah," she said finally. "Eliora," he said. She looked at the porthole, then at the door, then back at him. "You shouldn't have boarded this boat," she said. He looked at her, the dark hair escaping the bonnet, the gray eyes. 2 years written into her face, not as age, but as the particular weight of something carried alone for far too long. "I couldn't let you leave again," he said. She held his gaze, and then looked away, out at the water. Her folded hands were not entirely still. "How did you even see me?" "I was on the wharf. I was going for caulking cotton." She closed her eyes. "I was careful. I came in on the morning train from Camden. I was going to be gone before I saw you." "Yes." He leaned forward. "Eliora, I have kept every word of that letter for 2 years. I never looked for you. I never asked." I let you be wherever you needed to be. He held her eyes. But I saw you on that wharf, and I bought the last ticket on this boat, and I need you to tell me what the letter didn't. For a moment she looked as though she might refuse him even now, might reach for some new version of the same request. Go home. Forget you saw me. Let me be wherever I need to be. And he watched her consider it, and watched her set it aside. The way a person sets aside an old habit they finally recognized has stopped serving them. It's a longer story than a letter could hold, she said. I know, he said. We've got a boat and most of an afternoon. Start wherever you need to. She looked out the porthole for a long moment while the Maine coast went by in the flat, indifferent way of coastline in early autumn, gray and gold and utterly unconcerned with anything happening aboard the boat passing it. Then she looked back at him and told him the man's name was Silas Drummond. He was 36 years old, and there were warrants for him in 2 counties and 1 province across the border for smuggling, for an assault on a customs officer in Eastport the year before, and, though nothing had ever been proven cleanly enough to hold him, for the drowning of a man in Machias who threatened to report his cargo runs to the Revenue Service. He'd moved cargo and himself up and down the coast for years, which gave him new harbors and new leverage and useful distance between himself and whatever he'd left behind in the last one. And it was a pattern, she said, that she'd only fully understood once she'd had 2 years and a good deal of solitude in which to piece it together. A new port every year or two, a new woman he'd fixed his attention on shortly after arriving, and always, eventually, some trouble that sent him moving on again before the local authorities could build a case sturdy enough to hold. She hadn't been the first. She was fairly certain, from things she'd overheard in Bath, that she wouldn't have been the last either if matters had gone differently. He'd been watching Eliora since she was 19. Not the way a man watches a woman he hopes to court, but the way a man watches something he has already decided is his, patient and entirely unconcerned with what the something in question actually wanted. She had kept Micah between herself and Drummond's attention for the better part of 3 years without ever telling him so. The engagement, she'd believed, would be the end of it. A man like Drummond didn't chase what was plainly settled. She had been wrong. In July, he had come to the cottage and sat at her table and spoken quietly for perhaps 10 minutes. He had named the September date. He had named, in general terms, what would happen to Micah's new boat, and to Micah, and had assured her he would be nowhere near Port Solis when it happened. Then he had thanked her for the tea and left. She had written the letter that same night. I thought if I disappeared, he'd lose interest, she said. There'd be nothing left to threaten if I was already gone. She looked down at her hands. I went to my cousin in Bath. I didn't write to anyone. I stayed as invisible as I knew how to be. She paused. 4 months ago, I heard he'd moved his operation to Bath. He didn't know I was there, but he was there. She looked back out the porthole. I came back to Camden to see if there was anything, a witness, a record, anything at all that could put him in front of a magistrate for good. I found nothing. She met his eyes. I was going back to Bath to find somewhere else to disappear to. She said it all in the same level voice, the voice of someone reciting a thing she'd rehearsed alone for so long that the rehearsing had worn most of the feeling out of it. And it was only when she reached the end and fell silent that the feeling seemed to catch back up with her all at once, so that her hands, still folded in her lap, finally went openly unsteady. I kept thinking, she said quieter now, that if I just stayed far enough ahead of him, it would be like none of it had ever reached you at all. That you'd go on with the yard and the boat and eventually you'd... She stopped. I don't know what I thought you'd do. Forget, I suppose. I didn't let myself think past that. Micah sat quietly. He looked at her. 24 now, 2 years of running alone written into her face. The gray eyes that had watched him clearly since they were children and had kept him at a distance for 2 years for precisely that reason. He looked at her hands, still not entirely steady, and put his own hand over them. You should have told me. He said he'd kill you. That's a different thing from succeeding. She looked down at their hands together. I know that now, she said quietly. I've known it for 2 years. What neither of them knew was that a man named Otis Fenn had been on the Port Solis wharf that morning, running odd errands for Drummond in exchange for the protection Drummond's name bought him in certain company. He'd been at the landing for reasons of his own, and he'd noticed the dark-haired woman boarding the Portland steamer. Because 2 years earlier Drummond had described Eliora Vance in terms detailed enough to make her easy to recognize and impossible to mistake for anyone else. He'd also noticed the young shipwright sprinting the length of the wharf and hauling himself aboard as the boat pulled away. Fenn went straight to the telegraph office by the customs house. The message reached Silas Drummond in Camden, the steamer's first scheduled stop. A little over half an hour before the boat was due in, Micah and Eliora were still talking when the engine note changed and the deck beneath them began to slow. He saw the shift in her face before he understood the reason for it, the particular look of someone glimpsing through a window, the exact thing she'd hoped never to see again. He turned toward the porthole. On the Camden dock stood 2 men flanking a third, and the third was watching the second cabin's windows with the fixed attention of a man who has been given advance warning and has made good use of. "That's him," Eliora said. Her voice had gone level. The specific flatness of someone who has been afraid of a thing for a long time and has finally arrived at it and passed straight through the fear into something colder on the other side. Micah looked at Silas Drummond standing on the Camden dock, broad through the shoulders, patient, watching the cabin windows with the attention of a man who has never once understood that attention isn't the same thing as ownership. He looked back at Eliora. "Stay below until I come for you." "Micah, I need to know where you are. That's all I'm asking right now." He held her gaze. Her hands were still under his. "Come back," she said. "I will," he said. The boat touched the dock. He went out the far side, away from the gangway where Drummond's men were watching the passenger exit, and came around behind the customs shed. Drummond's 2 men were posted on the main gangway. Drummond himself stood at the center of the dock, hands loose at his sides, eyes fixed on the second cabin's windows. Micah stepped out from behind the shed. He had a revolver his father had given him years before, and had never once fired at anything but a target board nailed to the shipyard fence. And his hand around the grip of it felt foreign and heavy in a way it never had at that fence. He wasn't going to draw it first. His father had told him once, "Speak first, speak plainly. Let the other man make the first mistake." And in 28 years that advice had never once steered him wrong, though it had also never once been tested against anything more dangerous than a disagreement over lumber prices. The dock boards were wet from the morning tide and creaked underfoot, and somewhere behind him a gull was screaming at nothing in particular. And none of it felt real yet. Not the weight of the gun, nor the 2 men flanking Drummond, nor the fact that Eliora was somewhere behind him in a cabin he'd told her to stay inside of. "Drummond," he said. Drummond turned. He took Micah in with the look of a man recalculating a variable he hadn't accounted for, and then his expression settled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Ashford, didn't figure on you being aboard that boat." "Things changed," Micah said. "Where is she?" "Not here. Not going anywhere near you." Drummond regarded him with the patience of a man who has won enough of these confrontations to believe they all end the same way. "You've no idea what you've stepped into." "I know exactly what I've stepped into," Micah said. 3 years of you deciding a woman belonged to you because you saw her outside the chandlery. A threat against me to run her out of her own town. 2 years of her hiding to keep that threat off my back instead of letting me help her carry it. He held Drummond's eyes. "I know all of it now." The flicker across Drummond's face, uncertainty sliding fast into anger, was the only warning there was. He jerked his chin at the man on his left, who came forward at a run. Micah stepped into the rush rather than away from it, and brought the butt of the revolver down across the man's wrist before his own weapon hand cleared its holster. The gun clattered onto the dock boards. Micah kicked it toward the water. He turned. Drummond was 3 feet away, revolver already drawn and level. Micah raised his own and fired. The shot went wide. Drummond had moved faster than a man his size had any right to. Drummond fired once in answer. The bullet caught Micah high in the left shoulder, a sharp, specific burn that took the edge off the world rather than the center of it. He registered the pain and kept his feet and brought the revolver back up. Then, from the direction of the customs house. "Drop it, now." The Camden Harbor constable, with 2 deputized men behind him, someone below decks had gone for help the moment the trouble started, with the particular speed of people who understand exactly what's called for. Drummond didn't drop it. He swung toward the constable's voice, weapon still raised, and the constable fired once. Drummond went down onto the dock boards and did not get back up. The dock went still. Micah stood there in the Camden afternoon with his shoulder burning and the revolver still in his hand, and then the cabin door banged open and Eliora came across the boards at a run and put both hands to his face and looked him over. "You're shot. Shoulder. It's not deep." "Let me see it." He let her. She was right. It wasn't deep. But she kept her hands pressed against it anyway. And he let her do that too, standing there on the dock while a small crowd of onlookers kept a respectful, curious distance, and the constable's men saw to Drummond's body and the two other men were led off in irons. And the Camden afternoon went quiet and gray and ordinary around the two of them as though nothing at all had happened. Though both of them understood, standing there, that a great deal had happened and that it was finally, truly finished. The harbor constable's name was Amos Kell, and he'd kept order along that stretch of the Camden waterfront for the better part of 11 years. And he handled the whole business with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has been handed a situation with clean enough edges to manage. He'd seen his share of trouble come off the boats over the years. Drunk sailors, cargo disputes, the occasional knife pulled in the alley behind the tavern, but rarely anything with this particular shape to it. A shooting on his own dock in broad daylight involving a man half the coast had quietly suspected for years and had never once managed to pin. Anything, too, a man whose name, it turned out once the wires started coming back, had been quietly circulated among harbor constables from Eastport clear down to Portland for the better part of 3 years without a single one of them managing to make it stick. He took his time with it precisely because he understood how much it mattered to get the account right. And he had his deputies keep the curious dockside crowd well back while he worked, and he sent a boy for tea, unprompted. When he saw how badly Eliora's hands were still shaking 2 hours after the fact, and he waited, without comment, until she'd finished it before he asked her anything further at all. Drummond was dead. His 2 men were in custody by nightfall. Taken without much resistance once their employer was no longer standing to give them orders, both of them, by all accounts, rather relieved to have the whole business over with one way or another. The telegraph lines were already carrying word up and down the coast, county to county. The way news of that particular kind always seemed to travel faster than any of the ordinary business a small harbor town usually had cause to send, by wire. Micah sat in Kell's office with his shoulder freshly bandaged, the sling stark white against his good coat, and gave his account plainly, in order. The engagement, the threat delivered at the kitchen table in July, the letter, Eliora's 2 years, the wharf, the boat, the dock, leaving out none of it, including the parts that reflected poorly on his own judgment, because it seemed to him, sitting there, that half-truths had already cost the two of them quite enough. Eliora gave her own account separately, in the next room, with the directness of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down and has no intention of picking it back up again for anyone's comfort, including her own. Kell listened to both of them, made his notes in a slow, deliberate hand, occasionally asking a quiet, clarifying question, but never once interrupting either account in a way that suggested doubt, and sent wires to the county sheriffs and, for good measure, across the provincial line. The answers came back by evening. Drummond had been wanted for smuggling in 2 counties, for assault on a customs officer in Eastport, and was the leading suspect, though never formally charged, in the drowning death of a man in Machias the year before. His 2 men would be transported to face their own charges. Kell looked across his desk at the young shipwright with his arm in a sling, and the young woman with the gray eyes who had spent 2 years running from something and had finally stopped. "You 2 can go home," he said. Micah looked at Eliora. She looked back at him. "Yes," Micah said. "We can." They took the Wednesday steamer back up the coast. The Camden doctor had dressed the wound properly and told Micah it would be stiff for a fortnight and would heal clean. On the way home, the coastline slid by in reverse, gray rock and white spray, and the gulls wheeling over the wake, and neither of them felt any particular need to fill the quiet right away. Eventually, Eliora said, "I should have told you from the start." "Yes," he said. "I was so frightened." "I know. I understand why you didn't. He looked out at the water. It doesn't change that you should have. But I understand it. She was quiet a moment. I wrote to you once. 6 months after I left, I wrote all of it. Drummond, the threat, where I'd gone. She paused. I burned it before I sent it. I was afraid he had someone watching the post. He looked at her. There was a letter, he said, that you didn't send. Yes. There's been a letter for 2 years, he said, that I didn't send either. She looked at him. He reached into his coat with his good arm and drew out a folded square of paper, soft and worn along the creases from being opened and refolded more times than either of them could have counted. He held it a moment before he gave it to her. I wrote it the first month, he said. Every time I thought about chasing after that steamer, I wrote it instead. 6 times. I kept the last one. She took it. She read it slowly. And he watched her face while she did. And when she finished, she folded it carefully back along its own worn creases and held it in both hands. 6 times, she said. 6 times, he agreed. She leaned her head against his good shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And the Maine coast went on sliding by outside the window, gray and gold and entirely unhurried, and the 2 years were finally over. And everything that had always been meant to happen was still waiting ahead of them, patient and unchanged, with the particular certainty of things that were always going to come true eventually. They were married in September, the same month they'd first chosen, 2 years later than planned, in the same Port Solace church with the same minister who'd been ready to perform the ceremony the first time around. Eliora's aunt finished the wedding dress in the 3 weeks between Camden and the wedding day, working late by lamplight most evenings, her needle moving with the particular patience of someone who had waited 2 years to finish a task and wasn't about to rush the final stretch of it. Now that the waiting was finally over, she never discussed it. She simply finished it, because some things need doing, and the doing is reason enough on its own. The church itself was small and plain, whitewashed clapboard with clear glass instead of colored, so that the morning light came through unfiltered and fell across the pews in long, honest bars. And half of Port Solace had turned out despite the short notice, because a wedding delayed 2 years by a thing nobody quite understood the whole of was, by then, a story the whole town had a stake in seeing finished properly. Micah stood at the front of the church in his good coat, his shoulders still faintly stiff, and watched Eliora come up the aisle carrying wildflowers instead of anything formal. Sea lavender thing formal, sea lavender and beach rose. The kind that grew wild along the cliff path above the harbor. She'd picked them herself that morning before the sun was properly up, walking the path alone in the gray early light because she'd wanted, she told him later, to stand in that particular spot once more as an unmarried woman before she went and changed everything. He thought about a May morning 2 years before, and the gorse blooming yellow on the cliff top and the way the light had caught her hair. He thought about a letter that had said, "Please do not," and 2 years spent honoring it exactly. He thought about a wharf in Port Solace and a last ticket and a woman in the second cabin who had told him he shouldn't have boarded that boat. He thought about every moment along the way that could have gone differently, and the particular mercy of having arrived here anyway. Her father walked her down, the lighthouse keeper's careful, slightly formal steps. And when he handed her over to Micah at the rail, he shook Micah's hand for a moment longer than the occasion strictly required. And neither man needed to say anything about what that extra moment meant. She reached the front of the church. She looked at him. And for just a second, neither of them heard the minister clear his throat to begin. Both of them simply standing there taking the measure of how long a road it had actually been to arrive at this particular, ordinary, sunlit spot. Afterward, out on the church steps, Eliora's aunt took Micah's good arm and looked between the two of them. 2 years, she said. Not an accusation, just an accounting of it. 2 years, Micah agreed. She shook her head and went off to speak to the minister. Eliora took Micah's hand. The cliff path, she said. He looked at her. What about it? I want to walk it tomorrow morning, before anything else. He looked at the September light catching her dark hair, the same light, the same eyes that had watched him clearly since they were children. Early, he said, before the whole town's awake. Yes, she said, and they walked away from the church into the Port Solace evening, past the shipyard where the sloop sat moored and waiting, past the chandlery where she'd once seen a man watching her from across the street, past all the ordinary landmarks of a town that had very nearly become the place they lost each other in instead of the place they'd built a life. The cliff path was less than a mile off, the gorse long gone to green by that time of year. And neither one of them was going to waste a single morning of what came next. Micah Ashford ran the length of a Port Solis wharf on a Tuesday afternoon in September. He'd gone down for a delivery of caulking cotton. He'd been walking toward the rope walk. He'd seen dark hair 40 yards off and recognized the particular way she carried herself, and he had run. He had a ticket bought on instinct and a certainty that had survived 2 years of keeping a promise he probably shouldn't have kept quite so completely. That turned out to be enough. I think often about the letters that never got sent. The one Eliora wrote at 6 months and burned before she could seal the envelope. The 6 that Micah wrote and carried folded in his coat until the last one had gone soft at the creases from being opened and closed and never once mailed. All the things we write to the people we love and then don't send, because the moment feels wrong, because the risk feels too large, because we tell ourselves there will be another chance to say it. There is not always another chance. Micah had one because he happened to be walking toward a rope walk on an ordinary Tuesday, and he recognized what he saw, and he ran for it. And it is worth saying plainly that most people never get that particular stroke of luck twice, and some never get it at all. Don't wait for the right moment to arrive on its own, fully formed, announcing itself. It rarely does. The right moment is far more often the ordinary one you happen to be standing in when you finally decide to act. Dressed exactly like every other moment that came before it. Easy to miss if you're waiting for something more dramatic. Send the letter you've been carrying folded in your coat. Make the call you've been putting off until the timing feels better, because the timing will very rarely feel better on its own. Run for the boat while it's still close enough to the dock to catch. Don't let the water widen while you're still deciding whether the leap is worth making. Thank you all so much for listening today. If this one found you at the right moment, I hope it stays with you a while. Until next time, fair winds, and I'll see you all again soon.